and lovely to see everybody today. I am Ravideep Kaur, and I am going to be in conversation with the great, wonderful Pragya Agarwal today. I am based in Scotland, and I'm an anti-oppression consultant, and I kind of center my work around like decolonial thought and processes. So I'm going to introduce Pragya, which I'm sure everybody here knows everything about her. But this is Dr. Pragya Agarwal. She's a behavioural and data scientist, and she has written numerous research papers and is the author of SWAY, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and Wish We Knew What to Say, Talking with Children About Race. And today we are here to talk about this extraordinary book called, I want to call it Motherhood, but Otherhood as well. Pragya is also a passionate campaigner for racial and gender equality, a two-time TEDx speaker, organizer, and she regularly writes for The Guardian, Prospect, Forbes, Scientific American, and New Scientist, among others. So, yes, amazing to have you here, Pragya. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's amazing. Thank you. This
I'm
wow.
actually I was just going to say that I am actually based in the northwest of England, but today I am in Yorkshire. We're staying somewhere because of half term, because it's England half term, and the internet in our cottage didn't work. So I ran over to the main office. So you can see my background is not as attractive as it is. I'm sitting in the corner of this main office in this place, right? So yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
Great. At least we are here. The technical issues tried to kind of stumble us, but we are both here, and it's lovely to see you. I hope you've had glorious weather in Yorkshire.
It's been fantastic. Today was a little chilly, but yesterday was blazing. It was really hot.
Amazing. So I'm going to get stuck right in. Welcome to everybody. Everybody that's here, we are going to have a kind of 20-minute question and answer for yourself. So if anybody's got any questions to ask or start thinking about, please pop them in the box below where it says ask the question, and then we will figure that out further down the line. But yes, here we are, this beautiful, amazing book, both beautiful on the outside and amazing in the inside. Can you tell us a little bit about the artwork?
Yes, I love it. It's by a designer called Anna Morrison, and but it was mainly done by my publisher art department, Canongate art department, and they're fantastic. They come up with these really great striking covers, and I had an idea that it has to be very kind of intersectional and fluid and bright and striking, and not based in some kind of idealized notion of womanhood and idealized notion of women's bodies and beauty. So that's where they were working from. So it's kind of fluid and flexible, but also represents this kind of intersectionality in a way, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything that you wanted, that cover is, because there is just, there is like a fluid kind of movement throughout all of this book, including that cover. So Pragya, motherhood, why this book? What compelled you to write this book?
It's a big question, and I could just answer this question all evening, but
absolutely.
But I think because I've been working in kind of thinking about biases and the biases we learn and unlearn, and so I wrote Sway, which was all about science of unconscious bias, and then it was followed up with this kind of parents and teachers and carers, the book about how developmental psychology, what it shows about how children form a notion of race and bias and prejudice. And I realized that, I mean, even though I might not talk, and I was writing about motherhood penalty and motherhood bias and motherhood load, and how pandemic showed us about emotional and mental load that women carry more. And even though we are striving for gender equality, and in the most gender equal households, like my husband does a lot of the work, most of the work, if my children are asked who cleans the house, they will probably say their father, which is really good. But still, women carry a lot of emotional and mental load. And I think when I came to writing my next book, I reflected on my life, and I thought about how motherhood is the basis for so much gender inequality, how much of our choices about our reproductive decisions is not just affecting mothers or women, but also every woman. Every woman is shaped by these decisions. Every woman is judged by these decisions about whether they want to become a mother or not, whether they become a mother or not. I had a child very young, very early on. So, and then I was a single parent. So I went through that phase. And then I went through infertility, IVF. I realized mothering and motherhood shaped so much of my life as well. And so I was writing about societal and political and social construct of motherhood. And I realized I can't talk about these things without reflecting on my own life and my own experiences, because we don't really hear these narratives of motherhood from brown women, from women of color as much, because mainstream motherhood is so much based in white people, able-bodied women.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think this is just the intersectionality part of this book is so important to just start to open up these conversations. And even in our own positionalities, like for me, as a South Asian woman, as a South Asian mother, there was just so much relatability that I haven't seen in the mainstream narrative at all. And particularly when it comes to the way that patriarchy plays out as well, from a South Asian perspective, I feel like we are starting to have these conversations maybe in women of color safe spaces. This this aspect of sharm and log kya kahenge, this kind of thing are happening in safe spaces, but to see it in this mainstream narrative, why was that really important for you?
I think we all are always looking for stories that reflect our own life, representation. We're always talking about representation. But I realized that all through my life, even in media, in adverts, in books, in literature, I'm not seeing my life reflected back at me or my experiences. So I feel like when we don't see these stories reflected back, we always feel we are alone, that nobody else is going through these experiences. And we internalize these kind of shame of going through it alone, that something is wrong with my body, for instance, through my infertility treatment. I realize I'm not seeing many stories about brown women. I'm not seeing people talking about, I'm not even seeing brown women in posters or in adverts. And things are changing a little bit, but still, I mean, you can see how homogenized motherhood is, because when this book proposal was submitted, there were so many people who said, publishers who said, oh no, I have another motherhood book coming out next year, which was nothing to do with this book. This book was very different. It was about a white person writing about bringing up teenage daughters. But they still homogenize a narrative of motherhood, that if I've got one person writing about motherhood, that is it. And I realized that is why brown women, because of societal context or because of all the shame and guilt sometimes we carry, or the pressures from our communities, we don't talk about our experiences honestly and openly. And I think it was really important for me to say, actually, I want to talk about it so that maybe it will resonate with somebody else, and maybe they can feel they're not alone, and we have to start to spur on these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I felt very seen in this book, in this narrative. But I also think, the way that we think about motherhood, like you were saying, this homogenous group, other, people that are not mothers can pick up this book and get so much from it as well, because it is so vast. There's that universal thread through it of how we look at society and how society is constructed. And I think with the pandemic, I'm going to speak about this later, that you wrote this book through this lockdown, through this pandemic, and the pressures specifically on women in terms of inequities and labor, overload. What did you see happening in society while you were writing this book, but also from a wider context of when we were in lockdown, the pressures specifically put on women and then mothers as well?
Yeah, as you say, this book is not just for women who are mothers, because our choices to be a mother or not affects everybody, not just women, men as well. I think this talk about fertility, or the pressures we put on people, or how we see women's bodies, and all these things affect men as well as women. These stereotypes trap everybody. These norms trap everybody. So I think it is it is a really important discussion that everybody has to get involved in. But during pandemic and lockdown, I think some of the inequities really became heightened and visible, but also some of our privileges became very visible and evident as well. I think we were talking about how we were intensely parenting and mothering during this time. And even though men were at home and were getting involved, we saw through research that women were the ones who were carrying more of the mental and emotional load. As I said, even in households which are supposed to be very gender equal, like we're trying to model gender equality in our house. I think it's again comes back to kind of stereotypes and the kind of feminine and masculine tropes about who is more nurturing, who is more caring. It's about also the pressure women put on themselves, thinking, I am supposed to be better at this. This is supposed to be my job. This is supposed to be my responsibility. And we internalize these beliefs and we put on this pressure on ourselves that if something goes wrong, then it is my fault. If my children are not doing very well, that it is my fault. Then I should be the one looking after the house. I should be the one able to do everything. I should be able to be a superwoman. I've written about it in other places. I should be the one who can manage it all and without asking for help. So I think this was happening during lockdown. But also we became very aware of our privileges, about who has more privileges, who's able to deal with the lockdown better than others. But yes, I mean, this whole discussion about motherhood opened up. People were talking more honestly about how the pressures, because our public and private personas became so intersecting. Yeah, I mean, we were letting people into our house and into our homes, and children were joining Zoom meetings, and children sitting on our knees while we were having meetings. And suddenly, there was no boundaries were very blurred, and suddenly people could see, oh my God, we're all in this place. But also, writing the motherhood, that the choices around women's reproduction or reproductive decisions became quite relegated to a very low status. Even if when other sections of the society were being given priority, women's reproduction or reproductive decisions were not given priority. From contraception or abortion or access to abortion services or access to maternity services, who can accompany them into maternity wards, all those things were not clear, were not very clear policies around it. It seems like while motherhood is idolized in our society, women are not given the freedom to choose whether they want motherhood or not. And this became very, very evident in lockdown, because we always feel like there are some men sitting somewhere making these decisions for women. I think men, and I write about in the book that there are no women in these policy-making situations. So they don't really know what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, for anybody who picks up this book, it's so well researched. Like, it's that mixture of the statistics and the historical context, but also there's this thread of your own personal story, which I just think makes it so relatable. So, like, I was so touched by it. I didn't want to put it down because I was like, well, what happened next, kind of thing. But why is it important that we look back at history to see where these narratives came from? You know, from the point of view of what we're seeing with racial equity and equality, it's become really apparent that we need to understand our history to understand our present day narrative. And I felt like women's bodies and just this narrative around that, reading this book really brought that to the forefront for me.
Yeah, as you say, history shapes our present and our future. And there is always this notion of whose history are we reading, who has written this history, who had the privilege or the opportunity to write the history, and who tells us what our history is, what our past is. You know, we're always, these histories also biased, as is science is also biased. All the scientific theories that we read about, they're based in certain biased beliefs which were used to justify oppression, eugenic beliefs as well. And history is shaped by that. So we see a version of the past that we read, and we often don't really hear about a kind of a narrative of history. We only hear it from a dominant, from the people who have dominance in society, you know, who can shape this ideology, who can shape the history. But we know that history shapes the hierarchies in a society, about who has more power, who has more privilege, who is at the top of this hierarchy, who is shaping the narrative, who's shaping the dominant ideology. And that creates a systemic and structural biases in our society, the prejudices, racism in our society. And it was really important for me to look back into history as far as I could go, but not just in Greek philosophy or in medieval ages or in the Bible, but also Hindu Vedas and also Sanskrit shlokas and different kind of, and look at who has written these things. Like, for instance, there is this notion of natural childbirth that I was looking at, about why is there so much shame around in women still in 2021 that they had a C-section and they didn't have natural childbirth, which language creates biases. And I'm looking at like some NCT groups as well who are propagating this kind of beliefs that women are feeling that they wouldn't be able to bond with their children if they have had a C-section or they didn't undergo pain. And I started looking at some of the historical narratives, and there was a midwife, Dick Grantley Reed, who is a white man, who wrote about it, about how if you don't bear pain, then a woman is not really a mother. And it was talking about pain and the relationship between pain and being an instinctive mother. But he also wrote it from a very racialized perspective. So we know that these versions of history or scientific beliefs around pregnancy and childbirth were written from a white ideological perspective about how they saw indigenous communities and how they saw minority ethnic communities when they were in America, for instance. And they believed that women of color are very prolific, they can give birth very easily, and they can just go and have a child and come back and do all the things. And this is where these kind of racialized notions started off, which still exist sometimes in medical and healthcare domains, that women of color, especially Black women or indigenous women, have a higher ability to bear pain. And so they're not given as much pain treatment, or they're not given as much painkillers during childbirth. And so there's so much of this that we need to look at history to see how biases still exist, why biases still exist.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, and I'm really glad that you brought on, the narrative around Black women, minoritized women, and Indigenous women, because there was a part that I just wanted to kind of read out, which, reading it in black and white. So you talk about these ideas had, of course, first emerged in England during the colonial invasion of the Americas, with reports that the unfamiliar indigenous bodies reproduced differently, that they could have quick and painless labor alone in the woods, get dressed immediately, and trudge home with the infant, thereby mimicking the reproductive behavior of other animals and not that of the English women, whose own childbirth was observed in domesticity and revered. I think for me, I was just struck by the dehumanization of particular women, racialized women, minoritized women. But then this thread of intersectionality that you bring constantly to the forefront, you talk about, privileges and power in such a way as your own positionality as well. Like I'm sitting here and understanding that as a light-skinned woman, I benefit from this system as well as I'm marginalized by it. And I think what struck me throughout this book, every time there was statistics, you spoke about trans women, femmes, non-binary folk, and the fact that the statistics just aren't there.
Yeah.
And I think bringing that to the forefront continually, it was literally in every chapter. I think every part of the factual part, the stats of it, there was always this huge gap that you kind of pointed to and was like, there just isn't enough information here. And is that something that struck you while writing this book?
Yes, I think, again, it comes to, this is a very polarized debate, again, about trans women, because it is linked to the fact about who we consider women. And the basic question that lies at the heart of this book is, what is womanhood, and what is a woman, and how do we define a woman? And even though the book doesn't really go strikingly at that question, but that lies at the heart of it, about how we discriminate against certain people because they don't fit in this notion, on this box that we have created about femininity or womanhood. And I try to show that actually these idealized norms of womanhood are such a myth, it's such a fallacy, because even women who we consider cisgender women do not adhere, all women do not adhere to it. So how can we isolate some people and say that they are not women? And yes, I mean, I think I spoke to a number of people from non-binary people, from the queer community, transgender community, but ultimately these are not my stories to tell because I don't belong to the community. So I have to think about, I don't want to demonize them by being their spokesperson. And I wanted to include some of the stories. I included some of the testimonies which are publicly available, like in newspapers or magazines, and I tried to bring them in. Court cases, I talked about that, legal cases, when I talked about the notion of mother. But I ultimately decided not to include some of those stories because I cannot say if I spoke to 20 people, they are representative of that community. Again, I'm being tokenistic. Again, I'm being performative. Not born this book to be. So I want to look at stats and science, and again, it's not that, because ultimately, like we know through history, women were kept out of a lot of statistical analysis and results and data, and now we are isolating or marginalizing certain communities because we don't think that they are relevant to these studies as well. So unless we disaggregate the data more, unless and until we become more inclusive about data collection and about scientific studies, we will not have these testimonies that exist and these stories that exist at these communities about how they are the kind of privilege that we have, even when compared to a lot of other people who are discriminated against in the medical domain, in healthcare domain, in motherhood domain as well. So I think there is so much more need to think about these big questions about what makes a woman and what makes a mother.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you do that beautifully throughout this book. You know, you're centering your story in your own position from your own lens, because that's where you're situated, but with an understanding of there's other things going on within this paradigm of things happening. And I think sometimes when language becomes mainstream, such as intersectionality, there's a lack of understanding of depth and its fluidity, that you may be in one space and be marginalized or minoritized, but you may be in another space and be hugely privileged. Exactly. And I think that movement and that fluidity, when we hear about intersectionality, for example, it's such a gift to see the world and experience the world, but also take a step back and decenter yourself. What do you think about the way that we're having conversations around intersectionality, but also, you know, intersectional feminism, for example? It was something that was spoken about, an identity to kind of, you know, a lot of white women, I'm an intersectional feminist, without having a depth or understanding that when you move from certain spaces, it doesn't mean that you are not going to be marginalized or affected by the patriarchy, but the movement between the fact that in certain spaces you do hold a lot of privilege.
Yeah, I think the notion of intersectional feminism, I think, again, is very kind of restricting definitions and limited understanding sometimes, that we use these terms just to be performative. I see that quite a lot. And there isn't really, I mean, feminism is feminism, but there is such a, I think, eagerness at the moment in certain groups to hold on to some of their status and their privilege, and they don't understand that that's the privilege, to hold power, and that they have the power to actually define these kind of labels and groups and isolate or diminish certain people because they don't belong to these groups. And so I think but people who have faced discrimination in the past, and they've struggled and they've faced oppression, they should be the first one to hold their hands out and say, I'm here to create space for you now that you are the community who's facing oppression. That doesn't minimize my oppression, or that doesn't minimize my struggle in any way, but I understand the struggles you're facing and that I want to create space for you. Why can't we do that? Why can't people do that? Why can't more women do that? Why do we hold so strongly to these boxes that we are trying to get rid of? All our lives, women are trying to get rid of these boxes and tropes and stereotypes, but then we start trapping ourselves into it and say, actually, some people who do not belong into these very strict definitions or delimiters, and we are going to keep them out. I think that is huge. I find that really baffling, but also very worrying and terrifying and concerning, because again, I think there is a racialized element to it as well. Again, there is an element of who gets to decide who comes into these spaces, or who gets to decide that these spaces are not meant for certain kind of people, and these people can be kept out. And I think that is a privilege to be able to decide that, and to understand that people don't. And privilege should be a form of opportunity to be an ally. And I think that's what people do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think privilege is not something to hide away from, because you can only understand how to redistribute once you pull your privilege to the top and be like, right, I actually hold privilege and power in these certain spaces. Now I understand about accessibility. Now I understand about redistribution. And I kind of wanted to veer off to the way that you talk about your privilege, going back to India, having the surrogacy, and the way that you talk about and checking your privilege. Like there's a big narrative around that, about it's almost like the inner dialogue that you share with us about, oh, I wonder what's happening here. I wonder her positionality. I love that section of the book, actually. And I'd love for you to speak a little bit about you going back to India, your home country, and just unpacking that as somebody who's now been in this country and going back, and what was coming up for you. And you speak about once you had the twins and you're in this apartment, and I'm a mother of twins as well. And really related to just that constant, the days just go into the hours are just in the days, and the feeding and the changing. It is just one, and you just couldn't leave that apartment, right?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think for me, even when I wrote Sway, but also especially while writing this book, if I'm talking about, as you say, if I'm talking about any kind of my position, which creates bias towards me or discrimination towards me, or any minority aspect of my identity, I have to check my privilege as well, because I do have privileges. All of us do. All of us have privileges. And going back to India was an interesting thing. So even during fertility treatments, I'm talking about it from an intersectional perspective, because even though there were other aspects that discriminated against me, or even that created shame, guilt, fear, all those kind of things, and loneliness and isolation, at least we had the resources to get those treatments, which other people wouldn't. At least we had the opportunity to take time away from work to undergo treatment. We had a car that we could drive to these clinics. We could, all those kind of things are privileges, and privileges seems like a really heavy word, but it is just that gives us me an opportunity to do certain things which other people can't. So I have to think about, there are certain people who do not have access to these resources, who cannot do that. But about going back to India, I think surrogacy is a hugely polarized debate as well. And I think it comes again from that perspective about, do women really have the choice, a freedom to make choices about their bodies? And often we assume that women in minority ethnic or in certain countries do not have the freedom to make these choices. That's the fact that they are oppressed, so they don't have the ability to talk about what they want. And we assume these narratives and we know that there's a lot of the research that's been done in this area is being done from a very Western perspective and a critical gender perspective as well. But the research that's been done from Indian campaigners and Indian activists has been different. So I think there's a need to do a more nuanced discussion or discourse around it, rather than look at it in a binary sense about black and white. And India creates a lot of panic around these debates as well. But going back to India after 20 years for me, it was interesting because, of course, I'm never completely British, and I talk about that. But I'm also not completely Indian anymore, because I just don't feel like I speak. My English is with an accent, but my Hindi is with an accent as well now, or my English has an accent. immediately puts me in the position of I'm a foreigner. The way I act as well. I have a white husband, so I go back and immediately that creates a notion of privilege for me as well. I'm seen as an outsider. And obviously I have more financial resources than a lot of people there.
Yeah.
So again, that creates a level of privilege for me as well. And so, and education and all those kind of things. India is a vast country. Obviously, there's again huge economic disparity in people there. So we can't match certain people, but we can. Certain people can't match up to us. But there's always an assumption because of the long colonial hangover that there's a notion that whiteness is better, or foreigners, people coming from the West would have more money or would have more resources or are better in some way, because this imperial legacy continues in India. We know about colorism. So yeah, that made me very much aware about my privileges, because I always felt like I was home, but I wasn't really home, because I missed home so much about back in UK. That is my home. And I felt this torn between this notion that I'm actually at home. This is my homeland. This is my motherland. And I want to escape this place now. And I want to go back home. And I felt like I was betraying my home country and my motherland all the time. So there's this guilt, immense guilt as well. So yes, there's a lot of things going on there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I know when we go back, they can tell straight away, even if you're speaking the language and you feel quite comfortable. So it's really interesting that narrative was surrounding you as well, and you're kind of navigating that whilst also, there's so much other things going on. I'd love you to talk about the bit about the mangoes, because I really loved this bit in the book, even though you were told maybe not to write about it or whatever. But just some of these pieces about kind of resonance as well, that the connection and relationship to such a fruit, for example, and the way that you write about it is poetic. And I just felt like a presence when you're devouring that mango. And it took me back to like my childhood and watching my mother and just eating it in a completely different way than I would know, because of like my Western way. It was just, it's actually an art form to watch. Tell me about your relationship with mangoes.
I really want a mango right now. But I think certain things become part of our identity. Certain things become nostalgia. Certain things become a thread that runs from our grandfather, from my father, from my mother, from my grandmother to my children. Especially in a sense of a diaspora, that I live here now. I want my children to feel a connection to the country they were born in, or the my birth, and they don't. And I always have this anxiety that runs through me, that how are they going to ever know me? How are they going to ever know the place that I come from? And so I think it's symbolic in a way as well about how my memories are structured. So there was a lot of things while writing this book. There are expectations from people of color to write a certain way, to not write about it. And I recently wrote a piece in the bookseller, if anybody wants to read it, about why shouldn't I write about the mangoes? Because I think a lot of diasporic community talks about let's not write about the mangoes or the spices, because that's the way people stereotype us, that we are only going to write about crowded places or busy places in Delhi, or the dust or the dirt or the pollution or the cows. But what if that is my truth? What if that is my reality? Why shouldn't I write my truth, my memories? Why should I shy away from them because somebody else might stereotype me from that? And I think I worried about that quite a lot about whether I'm reinforcing these stereotypes about Indian people or Indian cities, or the way we live or the way we eat. But ultimately, I think when I'm writing something from personal experiences, from memory, a memoir, I have to speak my truth, because that is the only way to build trust with the reader, because they have to know where I'm coming from, who am I? They have to know that through me, even if it's something that I shy away from, even if something that I'm afraid of, even if it's an undesirable aspect of me, So, but these were things. And living in Delhi was quite interesting, because we loved the food that was available. I mean, that is just amazing, the amount of things that you could eat, the takeaway. and the fresh fruits and vegetables, and and it was just freely available. And so I write about how my husband said we're living like locals, and I suddenly felt like, am I not a local? Am I a local? I'm not a local. You know, you keep wondering, who am I actually? What am I? Yeah, I talk about mangoes because it's a metaphor, but it's also a reality. It's about my memories, about my mother used to always talk about, remember that summer when the mangoes were really good, or we made panna, which is made up out of green sour mangoes, a sour drink, and with pepper and with cumin. And we always, and the char that she would put in, and this is from 3 years ago. Remember when that happened, when your grandfather was there, and everything, all these memories are linked and related together. You know, these milestones were created according to these memories of mangoes. But it's also now, when my 5-year-old loves mangoes, one of them, it makes me feel really warm inside, because I immediately feel like, oh, there's a connection from my mother, my grandmother, my childhood to her childhood now in some way. So I think we have to write the truth, and we have to think about our truth in our memories.
Absolutely. And I think there's a bit right at the start of the book where you talk about being confined in boxes, and it just felt so inspiring to read through this book, because I just felt Pragya is not in any box. She's coloring all out of the lines, and it just feels like truth. It feels authentic. And I think when people resonate on different levels, because there is universal threads throughout this, but when you see somebody's truth coming out, it gives other people permission to also speak about their truth. And I think that's so important about, you know, the starting point of books like this, changing up narratives, of pushing the boundaries. How do you feel about this book in particular being out in the world? Big question.
I was terrified initially. I wrote it and then I sent it to my editor. And at every stage, I kept thinking, it's so personal and so intimate, because believe it or not, I'm quite a private person.
Yeah, you do say that. And I'm like, really?
You know, that's there are things in this which I hadn't ever told anybody. I haven't talked even to my mother about it, you know. So but then I realized, unless we open it up, I am actually internalizing some of that shame and putting that pressure on myself not to talk about it, and I have to do that if I have to talk about these things. So I talked about it, and I worried at a lot of stage. I asked her if I was being really moany or whiny, or is very despair, or it's kind of a misery memoir. Or I also talked about, and I did worry about it. My husband didn't read it at all. He said, I really want you to be comfortable about what you want to talk about, because I make it very clear, this is my memories. I don't talk from perspective of anybody else. But I wanted to interview my scientific experience, my historical research with the memoir. So I think that is the kind of balance I wanted to create. But it is a challenge for a publisher, because it doesn't fit neatly in a genre. It's not a memoir. It's not a popular science book. And so it creates its own category, like the reviewer in the Observer said, there's a science of self that Waterstone should have a shelf for now, I think. And so it is a hybrid format. And there were other things that I really wanted to do in this book, about not italicize any of the Hindi words, which I really was very, very insistent. I don't want the language to be othered, because that is my language, and I don't want to do that. So I was trying to break a lot of norms and templates and standards with this, and I think it was great to have my editor's cooperation and support with that. And so I am excited about this book being out. I am hopeful that it will start conversations, and I am hopeful that it will, spur on some conversations, some challenge, some discomfort. But unless we sit in discomfort, we cannot change the status quo.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would like, if you felt comfortable, I don't know if you've got a copy right there in front of you, but just your hopes for this type of book. I think some of those final chapters just really bring everything together. And I know I would, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear you read something from those last few about the hope of this book, having this book out in the world. And yeah, I'll let you go for it, Pragya.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So I will read a little bit of the end, the start of the coda, which is the end last chapter, and I will read a bit towards the end of that as well.
Lovely.
Tick tock, tick tock. Time runs past. It is neither the end nor the start. Memories keep mounting up. Words collected, language amassed, labels assigned, symbols, signs, meanings. Childless, barren, infertile, geriatric mothers, traps, trappings, tropes. We get so caught up in norms and the normality of reproduction and family that the spaces outside and around seem claustrophobic. Maybe this book is my story, maybe not. But it is most certainly a story of how little we know of our own bodies as women and the way we are kept in the dark about them, shamed, admonished, and chastised, and how much of womanhood is signified by rigid parameters that put us right back into the boxes where patriarchy wants to keep us. How much we demand from our bodies and how much we allow others to demand of them. And I'm going to just read a little section towards the end. I've been looking for belonging, a sense of place, my complete self throughout my life. Not feeling like I fit in anywhere. I'm uncomfortable in my body and my being, straddling worlds and words, language and emotions at all times, being many different versions of myself. I resisted motherhood, avoided it, capitulated to it. But in the end, it was being a mother that has been my saving grace, allowing me to reconcile all my different selves. And suddenly, just like that, I don't need to search for a place to belong. I belong to myself as much as these children belong to themselves. I see my whole history stretching out behind me, holding me close and safe. And in some ways, that is a relief. While I was trying so hard to make sure my children belong to me, it became apparent that they will always only ever belong to themselves. And of course, even though we are used to seeing them as one unit, the twins, the babies, they, them, the girls, my children, they are each unique, so intertwined, but so specific, so exquisite, tender, fierce, shaped perfectly in their distinctiveness. Although I have worried about my right to be their mother, all that truly matters is their right to be their own person, their bodies, their privilege. No external gaze, no scrutiny, no shame imposed, no transformation wrested, no elegies to lives unlived and life unfulfilled. No one carving out a life for them. They carve themselves. Only a world unzipped for them to expand their selves, claiming an infinity. They claim themselves. I claim myself. You claim yourself. An incantation, a prayer, a charm, an ultimatum, urgent demand for today and eons to come.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You said something at the end of like a previous conversation that we'd had about the hope that your mother had had and the fears that she perhaps had. And I just found that really touching as well. The fact that we're all just trying to make dents for our children to have a better life. And I just want to thank you personally for making a dent in my children's life, because it's making me grow. And I think for all of our children, that's all we can kind of hope for, is to push these narratives and for them to belong to themselves. So thank you. Really
Thank
beautiful.
you so much, Ravideep. Thank you so much for having me and for talking with me.
Oh, it's been beautiful. Thank you. We've got some questions. So just to finish off, let me just pop them on. Right. Oh. Right, for some reason I cannot write. Let's take. Right, I'm just going to read this one out, Pragya.
Sure.
Making space for changing narratives where there are any aspects of motherhood that you thought were too taboo, too vulnerable. We talk so little about motherhood going wrong, a mother's cruelty or regret.
Yeah, I think that is a huge, that's a huge topic, about how do we talk about regret? How do we talk about ambivalence? I think ambivalence isn't given space in women. It comes down to like black and white. It's about a binary. It's about saying, if I regret some aspect of motherhood, that means I don't love my children. And there's this judgment imposed on us. Why can't I say, I love my children, but I don't love them all the time? Because sometimes it's really difficult and I'm struggling and I just want some headspace and I want to be able to hear what I'm thinking without having
hello.
Going...
I was going to say, hello, homeschooling.
But also, I can't even go to the toilet in peace, So there's somebody there all the time. Sometimes it becomes like you are completely consumed by motherhood, and that happens. And that is also a pressure we put on ourselves. And I've talked recently a lot about motherhood guilt. And ultimately, I think it's also these tropes and stereotypes that we kind of internalize, saying it is my responsibility and my responsibility alone, that it should come naturally to me, that I don't have to be prepared for it. I don't have to learn to be mother because it should come naturally to me. And if I'm struggling, that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not doing it right, that I'm finding it difficult, but nobody else is finding it difficult because nobody else is talking about it. But even if you say that you're finding it difficult, there's always this notion of, but oh, look at that, how lucky you are. Yes, we are lucky. I mean, after treatment, and I talk about that, there was this notion that I've desired, I've wished for these children, I've prayed for them, I've gone through all these things. How can I regret that? And those early months were extremely hard. I mean, I felt like I'd lost myself completely, even though I knew what was coming. So I think we need to have more conversation, but we need to have more intersectional conversations again about this, because, not every socioeconomic class, or about sexuality, about chronic illness, about disability, about ethnicity, certain communities, you're not even allowed to talk about mental health after childbirth, focus is so much on children. So I think, yes, regret, ambivalence, and the notion of struggle is not given space for women to talk about, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think opening up these conversations where we can have real, raw, honest conversations about what it's really like, because we all know that if we sit in shame, we can't move forward. And most of us are having similar experiences. Like, it isn't great all the time. And that's why I was saying, like, homeschooling, having your children around all the time has completely challenging for a lot of parents. Right, thank you, Pragya. I'm going to move on to the next one. Are you hopeful? This is from Feli. Oh, sorry, just flipped up. Are you hopeful or pessimistic about choice, from becoming a parent to being a parent, with a Tory government, austerity cuts, and reactionary feminism, in quotes? How do we correct course?
Oh. Just because you're here,
lots of questions in there. Yeah.
You're here and you're talking about these things, and there are people like us talking about these things. There are people who are writing about these things. There are people who are fighting against these notions of taking away choice from women, in here, in America, in everywhere. Yes, the struggle is becoming quite it's terrifying at times, I have to say. I'm not pessimistic person. I'm quite an optimistic person. Otherwise, I wouldn't write these things. I write everything with the hope that things will change. The more we talk about it, we can change things. And so I'm very hopeful, and I'm hopeful with the next generation. I think if we see at the younger generation, they are so much more open-minded about these things. They are so much more honest about these things. They're more tolerant, I think, about gender and about sex and about fluidity, and they don't put themselves in boxes. At least I see with my oldest child and their friends, all those kind of things. But yes, there is a big pushback. We're talking about I recently wrote a thing for Byline Times about even with the anti-abortion movement, the whole racialized history of it, about how eugenic beliefs have fed into it, about even how feminism was very racist, has been racist, and how it's isolated or kind of marginalized certain women of certain classes and certain ethnicities. So yes, we need to talk about these things more openly. Tory government is, and any kind of the rise of fire right in a lot of places in the world are taking away choice from women. It's imposing restrictions on women's bodies, and that's very terrifying. But we keep fighting. I think we keep the struggle up, and things are bound to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, with the book and just historical context, none of these narratives are new. We're having the conversation. We've got the language, we've got the awareness, and I think that's so important to not lose that when we're having these conversations. As it does feel hopeless, you do feel hopeless at times, but I think holding on to hope, the fact that we're sitting here having these conversations, you've got a book like this out in the world, it is pushing those narratives. Right, got time for a couple more. This is from Hannah. You talk about different ways of mothering, which as someone who doesn't want children really resonated and felt validating. How do we get away from the narrative of women not being whole unless they have children? Possibly too impossible a question, exclamation mark. Yeah, but the title of this book, Otherhood.
Yeah, I think this is why this book isn't just for women who are mothers. It was to say that actually these choices that are imposed on women, these stereotypes, these boxes, these labels, and the notion through history, through science, that women are so strongly related to their reproductive function, their economic value, and their value in society is linked to their reproductive functions, is something that creates this myth that women are not whole until they are mothers, that every woman's destiny is to be a mother. And we have to move the conversation away from saying the having children or not has to be a choice. And much like men, I think men don't have these pressures. Men are not asked again whether you're going to have children or not. Masculinity or maleness is not associated with having children. And so I think we cannot achieve gender equality until we move this conversation along, where we say, actually, there is no one definition or description of womanhood, that woman is not defined by her ability to have children or not. And that will address a lot of things about ageism, about bias or discrimination against menopausal women, about all those things that women are downhill once they can't conceive. And there's all these fertility myths that are there as well. And I think the notion of choice obviously is, I don't know. I mean, I keep thinking whether we ever will have free will, or, the ability to make choice free of our social or environmental context. But the more we are having these conversations around why whether some people don't want children, and it's openly able to say that, I think that is a huge step forward, because even a few years back, women were not able to say that they will never want children, that they don't want children. And women are able to say that. I just hope that women can make that decision without thinking that it has to be between their career or children, or that it is because of something else that they're making this decision. They should be free to make this choice, much like any other choice in their life, without any kind of excuses or justification of why they're making this choice, and and I think when we think that women's body is their own, and their testimonies or narratives or their opinions about their own bodies can be trusted, I think that is where we need to talk about. That discourse has to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you speak about these interconnecting kind of dominant systems of oppression. I think even like capitalism and its exploitive nature, it's become really apparent again through this pandemic that actually a lot of the decisions made by this government were because of profit and capitalism, and just understanding that the dots connect. And when we're talking about one system of oppression, it is generally related to something else. And again, just having the awareness that we don't need these externalized notions for worth, like that is yours. And, you say it so beautifully at the end. And to me, it feels it feels like liberation, like when you have autonomy over the individual. Right, I think we've got one last question. So, yep, this one. Does the book explore chosen family? What makes a family beyond just giving birth? And on reading the book, I would say yes.
Yes, because I talk about this notion of how we decide, how often what we see in mainstream media or even in other motherhood books is so based around childbirth. This notion of mothering or motherhood, it has to be separated out. And motherhood is not just about childbirth or pregnancy. I had my children, twins, through surrogacy. I did not give birth to them. And I carried this shame through the month because I felt like my body is not doing something. And I worried a lot about whether they will be close to me, whether I'll have a bond with them. I read so many scientific papers and research and devoured them about it, but you internalize these kind of norms about what makes a family and you hear all these stories about what happens to children who have been born out of a certain way, like medicalized treatments or whatever. You hear so much panic and hype around some of these media the bylines, cherry picked from scientific research. So yes, I worried about that quite a lot. And so I talk about this notion of family, that we have to move away from this idealized notion of heteronormative notions, even of family. We have to move away about what makes a mother. And we have to think about mothering as a value to society and not just giving birth.
Absolutely, absolutely. Beautifully said. And I think also, you talk about heteronormativity there and just this notion of motherhood. And when you look back to Indigenous kind of communities and the way that mothering happens in the community and the villages, it was there. And that we have moved again from colonialism and this very westernized, Eurocentric way of like 2.4 children. And that's just the way it is. And we hear about it takes a village, but actually that is in Indigenous cultures when you kind of look back at ancestral wisdom. So it is looking at mothering in a completely different way. And I think that is all of the questions. Thank you so much for this conversation. And okay, I'm just going to read this out. Thank you all so much for joining us to continue exploring these ideas by the brilliant book. Yes, I would echo that. I think if we want to start, if you want to start having these conversations of pushing the boundaries that we keep talking about, it is supporting women, especially women of color, marginalized women or marginalized communities that are really pushing these narratives to understand why we need these intersectional conversations rather than it being, I'm an intersectional da-da-da. It is really looking into the humanity and the relationship of what people's experiences are, because we are understanding that we don't all experience oppression in the same way. It depends on our positionality. So please buy the book, start having the questions, and let's make a dent in change. That's what we're talking about. So thank you so much. Is there any last words that you've got, Pragya, for the audience?
No, thank you so much thank you so much to Lighthouse for this amazing setting this up and creating space for this conversation, and for all that you do for intersectional feminism, truly, rather than just saying it out. And thank you, Ravideep, for this scintillating conversation. And I'm really excited for you all to read the book, and let's keep talking and let's stay hopeful.
Let's stay hopeful. Absolutely. That is perfect words to end this on. Thank you so much for taking time out today. Please support Pragya's work and all people doing great things, including Lighthouse. Honestly, I would echo that as well. There is not that many people that kind of talk what they actually say, that they're really doing it. They're pushing these narratives and supporting minoritized communities. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.